Policymakers face a trade-off when it comes to regulating drug prices. Innovating new drugs is expensive, and to incentivize those investments, prices must be high enough that firms can expect to profit if their products make it to market. But high drug prices are a heavy burden for consumers, and there is consistent political pressure to lower them. This is especially true in the US. While most developed countries negotiate or regulate drug prices, the US gives pharmaceutical companies free rein. This leads to prices that are substantially higher than in other countries, and every US administration in the last 3 decades has proposed legislation to try to shrink this gap. These proposals commonly feature international reference pricing, or IRF. This is a form of price control that would cap US prices by those observed for the same drugs in a set of reference countries. It's typically assumed this would push US prices down to the levels observed in other countries, but these analyses miss a crucial point. Prices abroad are not fixed, and firms may react to these policies by adjusting them because they act as a price ceiling in the US. This paper explores these dynamics by developing a model of demand and supply in the pharmaceutical market and using it to predict how drug prices would adjust if the US were to implement price controls. The focus is on the US and Canada. Like many other countries, Canada regulates and negotiates its drug prices, and almost all drugs are substantially less expensive there than in the US. The authors model the demand side of these markets using detailed data on drug purchases to estimate consumers' sensitivity to price and their branding preferences. This allows them to simulate how consumers respond to price changes by substituting between competing drugs at different prices. These demand-side parameters are then incorporated into a supply model that determines how prices are set. In the model, firms set prices in the US to maximize profits without any constraints from regulators, while in Canada, prices are determined through bargaining. This means that these prices reflect a trade-off between producer profits and consumer welfare, with a particular balance determined by each party's relative bargaining power. This figure uses estimates from the supply model to show the distribution of margin differences between the US and Canada. The fact that this lies almost entirely above zero indicates that for most drugs, profit margins are larger in the US than in Canada, and often by a substantial amount. So the question is, how does this status quo change with the introduction of reference pricing? As a baseline, consider a rule that prohibits companies from setting higher prices for drugs in the US than in Canada. Conventional wisdom suggests this would bring US prices down to the level of Canadian prices, but simulations from the model actually show that IRF leads to small price decreases in the US and large price increases in Canada. On average, prices of patented drugs fall by 7.5% in the US, but increase by over 200% in Canada. These dynamics arise because IRF alters the balance of bargaining power between drug companies and Canadian regulators. Both negotiate with the knowledge that Canadian prices now act as a price ceiling for the US, meaning that lower prices in Canada entail lower profits in the US. And because the US market is substantially larger than Canada's, firms can now credibly threaten to leave the Canadian market if regulators insist on a price that substantially reduces their US profits. Thus, rather than forcing firms to lower their US prices, reference pricing gives them more leverage in their negotiations in Canada and drives up prices there. As seen here, IRF shifts the distribution of margin differences to the left, reflecting that firms can now sustain much higher margins in Canada. Can variations on this baseline rule make IRF more effective? For example, suppose multiple countries are included in the reference index. This gives regulators more leverage, and relative to the benchmark case, increases the policy's effectiveness. US prices decrease by a greater amount, while prices in reference countries increase by less. Even so, the unrivaled size of the US market means that profitability there still drives negotiations in reference countries rather than the other way around. Alternatively, regulators could also require that companies continue to sell their products in reference countries in order to sell in the US. This required comparison constraint nullifies firms' credible threat to leave reference markets, unless they are also willing to lose the US market, and shifts the balance of bargaining power in favor of regulators. This dampens the amount by which prices abroad increase and correspondingly increases the level of price decline in the US. Ultimately, however, if the goal is to rein in US drug prices, reference pricing policies as a whole pale in comparison to policies that allow US regulators to negotiate directly with drug companies. This would decouple US prices from market conditions and regulatory considerations in other countries and lead to substantial price declines. Thus, this paper argues that IRF rules on their own are unlikely to result in meaningful price declines for US consumers. This has important implications for the ongoing policy debate around US drug prices, and for other contexts where external referencing is widely used. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes research on the costs of pharmaceutical innovation, as well as papers on reference pricing and other forms of price control.